The salty spray stings as sailors cling to worn ropes, their knuckles white with effort, battling the roaring wind and towering waves. The creaking wooden deck shifts beneath them, every gust threatening to swallow the ship whole. Men and women aboard these vessels faced not just the vast, unknowable ocean, but silent enemies lurking within their bodies, parasites that thrived in the damp, crowded cabins, feasting on flesh and spirit. These tiny foes, unseen yet deadly, tested human endurance in ways that made every voyage a fight for survival. Behind the grandeur of exploration and conquest lay stories of suffering, resilience, and grit as mariners battled nature and disease alike. If you're captivated by the human side of maritime history, hit subscribe to reach 3,000 followers. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And let me know you're tuned in with a quick emoji. Stay curious, sailors. There's more beneath the surface than just the sea. You ever get that icy, biting sensation running down your spine? Imagine standing on a creaking wooden deck, soaked by the relentless salty spray, your skin raw and shivering as the wind howls through the rigging. The air smells of damp oak and burning tar, mixed with the stench of sweat, rotting bilge, and seaweed. Your ears are assaulted by the shrill cry of gulls and the groan of the ship fighting the wild sea. Now picture yourself in that chaos, lost in a storm, miles from home, with death whispering in your ear. Today we're diving into that gritty world of colonial maritime life during the Age of Discovery, a time when sailors braved not just the vast oceans, but deadly parasites that attacked in silence, ravaging their bodies and spirits. Let's explore what life was really like aboard those ships, galleons, caravels, and frigates during the 15th to 18th centuries. It wasn't just about grand voyages and treasure. It was about survival, resilience, and enduring pain no modern soul can fully grasp. We're going to reveal 11 parasites that made mariners' lives a living hell, and how these tiny foes shaped history as much as the ships themselves. If you love stories of adventure, hardship, and human grit, stick around. And hey, if you enjoy this dive into maritime history, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Want more stories like this? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a wave. First off, when we talk about ships in this era, think of massive wooden structures carved from 2,000-year-old trees, oak, cedar, and pine, glued and nailed together with iron fittings. These vessels relied heavily on handcrafted techniques, mortise and tenon joints, clinker and carvel, planking and tarred ropes. The hulls were sturdy but nowhere near watertight, especially after months of battering storms and salt corrosion. Every plank was a battleground against water, and every inch of wood was a playground for parasites. Life aboard was brutal. Strict hierarchies, hard routines. The captain held power like a king, but sailors' lives revolved around grueling shifts. The cruise day started before dawn, with tasks like scrubbing the decks, mending sails, and checking the rigging. Conditions were extreme: cold, heat, relentless humidity. The ship's lower decks became humid, dark caves, breeding grounds for disease and pests. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, rotting food, and the dampness that seeped into your bones. Among the many dangers, parasites thrived, slipping unnoticed beneath the radar until they attacked. Imagine a tiny creature invisible to the naked eye burrowing into your skin, feeding on your blood, or laying eggs in your gut. These creatures, fleas, lice, worms, became constant companions, often more deadly than storms or pirates. Let's start with lice, those tiny wingless insects that thrived in the crowded, dirty conditions. About 80% of sailors suffered from them. They feasted on blood, causing itching and disease. Scratching turned skin raw, inviting secondary infections. Lice also transmitted deadly illnesses like typhus, which could wipe out half a crew in a single voyage. Then come fleas, especially the rat flea. These weren't just annoying pests. They carried the bacteria responsible for the plague. When the rats aboard ships died off or escaped, fleas found humans, biting and spreading deadly infections. Imagine scratching open wounds that turn septic, all under the unrelenting sun or freezing cold. Worms are a different story. Hookworms and roundworms, often contracted through contaminated water or food, invaded sailors' intestines. These parasites caused anemia, weakness, and death if untreated. Imagine feeling your strength drain away, your stomach bloated and painful as these worms multiply silently inside. On top of that, scabies, a mite infestation, caused rashes and intense itching, making sleep impossible. These tiny bugs burrowed into the skin, creating tunnels and causing misery that could last for weeks. The constant scratching opened up wounds, inviting further infections. Diseases such as dysentery and cholera, spread by contaminated water, often accompanied parasitic invasions. Imagine the agony of diarrhea, dehydration and fever, with no medicine to stop it. The ship's water supplies, often stored in barrels that grew mold and algae, became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites, turning the voyage into a nightmare of suffering. So what did sailors do against these tiny foes? Not much, honestly. They had some rudimentary treatments like flea powder, dried herbs, sulfur or lime, but nothing could fully eradicate these pests. The best strategy was hygiene, changing clothes, hanging lice-infested garments overboard, and keeping the ship as clean as possible, which was nearly impossible on long voyages. The human cost was staggering. It's estimated that about 20% of deaths at sea during this period were caused not directly by storms or battle, but by parasites and related diseases. Sailors faced months or years away from home, fighting physical exhaustion and mental despair. The constant discomfort, the fear of sickness, and the loss of comrades made life aboard a test of human endurance. The psychological toll was enormous too. Imagine the isolation, the sense of helplessness, knowing that tiny parasites could kill you just as easily as a cannonball. Many sailors believed these pests were curses or punishments from the sea gods, adding a layer of superstition and fear to their already perilous existence. In the end, the story of maritime parasites isn't just about tiny creatures, it's about human resilience, the way sailors adapted, fought, and endured. Their suffering shaped maritime medicine, inspired new ship designs, and pushed forward the understanding of disease transmission. These tiny invaders, though invisible, left a tangible mark on history, reminding us that sometimes the smallest enemies can be the deadliest. So next time you think about the age of exploration, remember the sailors who fought not only the elements, but microscopic foes. Their stories of suffering and survival remind us that human spirit can endure the harshest conditions, be they stormy seas or tiny parasites. Can you imagine what it felt like to stand on the deck of a ship miles away from land with the salty wind slicing through your clothes? The air is thick with a mix of brine, sweat, and the faint, sickening smell of rotting wood. The horizon stretches endlessly, an unbroken line of churning water that seems to swallow everything. The sun blazes down mercilessly, turning your skin into a raw, peeling layer, while the cold spray of the sea hits your face like 1,000 tiny needles. The ship creaks and groans under the weight of the ocean, a prison on the waves. Today we're diving into the gritty reality of those long, treacherous voyages, the human experience of colonial-era maritime exploration. If you love stories of survival, hardship, and human resilience, you're in the right place. And hey, if you enjoy this, dive into history, go ahead and hit that like button. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Now, let's set the scene. It's the age of discovery, roughly from the late 1400s to the 1700s. Ships are the lifelines of empires, vessels that can carry hundreds of men across vast, deadly oceans. These ships, like the famous carracks or the smaller, faster frigates, were marvels of their time, up to 2,000 trees used just to build a single vessel. They were loaded with supplies, weapons, and hope. But beneath the decks, a nightmare was brewing. The crew faced dangers that went far beyond storms and pirates. They faced sickness, parasites, hunger, and despair. The mortality rate? Around 20%, sometimes higher. That means 1 in 5 sailors wouldn't see land again. Imagine that, each trip a gamble with death. But it wasn't just the stormy seas threatening their lives. The real prisoners were the tiny, relentless parasites that lurked in every corner of these floating prisons. Today, we're uncovering 11 of these tiny, deadly invaders that haunted sailors during the colonial age. They were parasites that could turn a voyage into a nightmare of pain, suffering, and death. So buckle up, This story isn't just about ships and maps, it's about the men, their bodies, their minds, and the unimaginable struggles they endured. Because believe me, you can forget the romanticized tales of exploration. This was raw, brutal, and visceral. And the worst part? It's often forgotten. First up, the lice. Small blood-sucking critters that thrived in the cramped, dirty conditions below deck. Imagine tiny, crawling things, their bodies rough and dirty, feasting on your blood while you sleep. They spread rapidly, especially when hygiene was almost non-existent. The itch was relentless. Scratches bleeding, skin inflamed. These pests carried typhus, a disease so vicious that it could wipe out entire crews. The fever hit fast, the rash spreading like fire. Gengivas bleeding, teeth falling out. Typhus was a merciless killer. Then there were the fleas. Not just an annoyance, but vectors for plague. When a flea bit a sailor, it could transmit deadly bacteria. The infamous Black Death had already decimated parts of Europe, and on ships it found a new home. Guys would wake up covered in bites, their bodies swollen, feverish, trembling from the chills. The sandpaper texture of the flea's bites left scars for life, and still sailors kept going, driven by the promise of riches and adventure. But not everyone was just bitten. Some parasites went deeper. Tapeworms, for example, could infest the sailor's guts after eating. Contaminated food or water. Imagine worms writhing inside you, stealing nutrients while you fought to stay upright. The pain was dull but persistent. Loss of weight, weakness, anemia, and in the middle of the ocean, there was no doctor to call. You had to tough it out or die trying. That brings us to the next nightmare. Intestinal worms like roundworms and hookworms. These tiny parasites could invade your intestines, causing severe malnutrition. The sailor's diet was often meager. Hardtack, dried meat, salted fish. Perfect conditions for parasites to thrive. The hookworms would latch onto your skin, through your feet or legs, burrowing into your flesh, causing a painful bleeding wound. Sometimes sailors would get so anemic they'd faint on deck. This wasn't just discomfort, it was torture. But it wasn't only the tiny parasites that made life hell below deck. There were also the blood-sucking leeches, especially when crews had to deal with freshwater sources. Imagine trying to wash your face or drink water, only to find leeches clinging to your skin or inside your water barrel. They were slow but steady, feeding on your blood, while you helplessly watched. And then there were the lices. Friends, maggots. Yes, maggots. Dead rats, spoiled provisions, or unclean conditions meant festering wounds filled with these wriggling pests. A cut or sore left untreated would quickly become a breeding ground. The maggots would consume the dead tissue, infecting the sailor further. It was a gruesome cycle, wounds festering, maggots thriving, and the body breaking down. But the horror didn't stop there. There were also bedbugs, which made their homes in the sailors' clothes, bedding, and hammocks. The bites left itchy, inflamed welts, another source of misery. These bugs fed on blood at night while sailors tried to sleep, exhausted from the day's endless toil. And still the list goes on. Flukes, tiny flatworms that could infect the liver or lungs when sailors ate contaminated food or drank contaminated water. These parasites caused fever, coughing, and jaundice, diseases that could easily be mistaken for other ailments. Many sailors lacked the medical knowledge to diagnose or treat these infections. Now you might think, well, at least the sailors could get some rest, right? Wrong. Imagine the constant torment, scratching, vomiting, trembling. Their bodies were battlegrounds. The parasites didn't just attack physically, they attacked psychologically. Men would lose hope, their mental health fraying with each passing day. Back then, survival meant fighting against all odds. Sailors relied on simple remedies, herbs, alcohol, poultices. Sometimes they'd try to burn out parasites with hot irons or use crude knives to cut out infected tissue, but often it was too late. Their bodies, already battered by the sea and disease, couldn't fight off the relentless invasion of these tiny enemies. So, what does all this tell us? That behind the romantic stories of discovery and exploration, there was a brutal human reality. People suffered, endured pain, and fought unseen enemies every single day. The ships were prisons floating in the vast ocean, full of tiny, deadly invaders waiting for their moment to strike. If you want to know exactly how these parasites infiltrated the sailors' bodies, how they spread so quickly, or how crews tried to fight back. There's a video here on the channel that dives deeper into each one. But for now, just imagine yourself there, standing on that creaking deck, feeling the cold sweat, hearing the distant cry of a man in pain, and knowing that beneath the surface of those great ships, a microscopic war was raging. And that's just part of the story. Because in the end, humanity's courage and resilience shone brightest when faced with tiny enemies that could cause death in an instant. It's a story of suffering, yes, but also of incredible endurance. The tiny parasites were cruel, but the human spirit was even more resilient. Next time, we'll explore the more insidious parasites, those that changed the course of history by spreading disease across continents, leaving a trail of death that still echoes today. But for now, think about the sailors who faced these microscopic terrors, often with no hope but their own grit. Because sometimes, the biggest battles happen in the smallest spaces. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a ship, the salty wind whipping through your hair. The sun beats down, mercilessly, casting a blinding glare on the endless blue. You're miles away from land, floating on a creaking wooden prison that's been your home for weeks. But it's not just the hunger, the fatigue, or the storms that threaten you. It's something far smaller, something invisible, yet deadly. Tiny parasites that invade your body, turning survival into a relentless nightmare. Today, we're diving into the gritty, human side of colonial seafaring, the real stories behind those microscopic enemies that haunted sailors during the age of exploration. Let's talk about what life was really like on those ships. You might think the biggest dangers were storms or battles, but in truth, tiny parasites were among the deadliest adversaries of all. Imagine the dread of feeling a sharp, stabbing pain in your gums or your stomach. Your gums bleed, your teeth loosen, and you can't brush away the invaders, because those invaders are worms, larvae, and microscopic bacteria crawling through your body. For sailors, this wasn't just discomfort. It was a slow, painful death sentence. So, how did these parasites get there? Well, the ships themselves were floating petri dishes, dirty water, spoiled food, and unwashed hands. Conditions perfect for infestation. And back then, hygiene was practically a luxury. Sailors might have had a bucket for rinsing, but often they drank seawater or contaminated supplies. It's no wonder that intestinal worms like ascaris and hookworms thrived. These parasites could infect up to 80% of a crew on long voyages. Cruel but real. Now you might wonder, how did sailors deal with this? They didn't have modern medicine or anti-parasitic drugs. Instead, they relied on crude, sometimes desperate remedies. One common method was using strong herbs, like wormwood or cloves, either to try to kill the parasites or mask the symptoms. Sometimes they'd give sailors purgatives, bitter, powerful concoctions that made them vomit or crap out the invaders. Others tried hot irons or knives to cut into infected tissues, painful, bloody procedures that often made things worse. Imagine a sailor named John, a young man with trembling hands and a trembling stomach. One day he's doubled over, sweating profusely, bile and blood mixing in his vomit. His gums are swollen and bleeding. His teeth feel loose. The crew's medic, a seasoned sailor with a scarred face and a steady hand, applies a poultice of crushed herbs to his gums, hoping to draw out the infection. But the parasites cling stubbornly. They can't see the enemy, only feel the pain. And it wasn't just worms. Fleas, lice, and tiny insects would hide in the ship's planks and bedding, further spreading disease and misery. Rats, too, brought plague and typhus, turning the ship into a cesspool of death. The crew knew that every scratch, every cough or fever could be the beginning of the end. But despite this, they pressed on, driven by the promise of new lands and riches. But not all. Infections came from within. Sometimes sailors would develop skin boils or abscesses, caused by bacteria entering through cuts or wounds. The ship's surgeon, usually an illiterate man with limited tools, relied on boiling knives, boiling powders, and the grim hope that the infection wouldn't spread. He'd try to lance the boils with a crude needle, sometimes heated in a flame, hoping to release the pus and save the man. Yet often, infections worsened, and sailors succumbed to sepsis, their bodies overwhelmed. And still, the worst was yet to come. Imagine a sailor once full of hope now weakened. Now, to the point of trembling, mouth bleeding, stomach cramping. The parasite's grip was relentless. Sometimes the worms would crawl into the liver or lungs. Other times, bacteria from contaminated water would cause fever and delirium. These diseases could wipe out entire crews, captive to tiny enemies, that traveled undetected in the dark, damp ship's hold. Today we have antibiotics, antiseptics, and advanced hygiene. But back then, it was grit, luck, and primitive science. The sailors' survival depended on their resilience, improvisation, and a touch of superstition. They'd burn aromatic herbs to mask the foul smell, sometimes believing it kept away disease. They'd scrub the decks with vinegar or salt, hoping to reduce the bugs, and if someone got sick, they'd often be quarantined. If they were lucky, sometimes chained in a corner, left to suffer alone. Imagine the human toll. Men with teeth bawling out, gums bleeding, stomachs bloated and twisted. They'd vomit, tremble, and sometimes die alone in the dark. Their bodies were battered not just by storms, but by microscopic invaders that could turn a healthy sailor into a shell of himself in days or weeks. But here's the twist: despite all the suffering, sailors found ways to fight back. Not always effective, but enough to give them hope. They used crude medicines, poultices, and tried to keep as clean as possible under the circumstances. They understood that common sense and determination were their best weapons. Sometimes they'd even pray, trusting divine intervention to stave off the unseen enemies lurking in the shadows of their ships. All of this paints a vivid picture of life at sea during the colonial era. It wasn't just adventure and discovery, it was human endurance in the face of tiny but deadly enemies. Their bodies, cramped in narrow quarters, filled with filth and disease, tell stories of suffering that often go unnoticed. These sailors endured pain, infection, and death, often with no more than their wits and a few herbal remedies to fight back. And if you think about it, their struggles laid the groundwork for modern medicine. The lessons learned from these tiny foes eventually led to better hygiene, sanitation, and disease control, paving the way for the health standards we enjoy today. But at the time, facing microscopic enemies was a brutal daily battle, a fight for survival in the most confined, hostile environment imaginable. So next time you hear stories of explorers and ships crossing oceans, remember this human side, the unseen war beneath the decks. These tiny parasites, like strongyloids, schistosomes, or tania worms, weren't just nuisances, they were killers. They changed lives, altered history, and tested the limits of human resilience. Because in the end, it's not just about the grand adventure, it's about the everyday fight against the smallest, cruelest enemies the human body has ever known. If you want to dive even deeper into how these tiny invaders spread, how sailors fought them, or how their legacy still shapes medicine today, there's a video here on the channel that gets into all those details. But for now, just picture yourself amid the chaos, gums bleeding, stomach churning, and tiny worms crawling through your body, facing an enemy you can't see, yet whose impact is impossible to ignore. Because that's the real story of colonial seafaring. Human beings battling microscopic enemies that could wipe them out in a blink, yet enduring with a courage that still inspires us today. Imagine yourself on a ship, hundreds of years ago, the salty air thick with the scent of wood, sweat, and the brine of the sea. The creak of the timbers is a constant reminder that you're part of a floating prison, packed tighter than sardines in a can. It's not just the wind or the waves that threaten you. Beneath the surface, unseen enemies lurk, tiny, relentless foes that could wipe out an entire crew in a matter of weeks. These weren't monsters from stories, but parasites, microscopic invaders that haunted sailors, turning their voyage into a nightmare of suffering and survival. Cruel, but real. You can forget the grand tales of discovery and glory. These stories are often overshadowed by the silent war happening on and inside the sailors' bodies. It was a battle against parasites like schistosomes, the blood flukes that burrowed into skin, turning veins into battlegrounds. Imagine the piercing pain, the itching, the blood smeared across the decks as these tiny worms wriggled deeper, disrupting lives and futures. Or Ascaris worms, those thick, thread-like creatures that invaded intestines, causing misery, vomiting, and sometimes death. These weren't just nuisances. They were killers, silent assassins lurking in contaminated food and water, waiting to strike. And it's not just worms. Think of strongyloids, tiny nematodes that crawled through the skin, creating open sores and intense itching. Or taenia, tapeworms that grew inside the gut, stealing nutrients, leaving sailors weak and emaciated. The infection rates on our ships could reach up to 20%, a staggering number considering the cramped conditions. Imagine the horror of it. Diseases that spread like wildfire in a prison of timber, salt, and filth. But it wasn't just the parasites themselves that made life hell. It was what they did to the sailors' bodies. Gums, bleeding from anemia, teeth falling out, skin riddled with ulcers. Imagine the trembling hands, the nausea, the constant ache, your body a battleground. These tiny invaders weren't just attacking your insides. They were breaking your spirit, transforming your once strong sailor into a shadow of himself. And still they endured. Survival meant adaptation. Sailors learned to fight back with rudimentary herbal remedies, garlic, wormwood, and bitter herbs, things to drown out the parasites or burn them out. Sometimes they relied on sheer luck, hoping their immune system would hold. But often, it wasn't enough. The suffering was brutal. Gengivas sangrando, dentes caindo, fevers that left men delirious. Many didn't make it past the first few months. Their bodies, strained and exhausted, became prisons for these microscopic enemies. Imagine the psychological toll. As their bodies weakened, so did their minds. Fear grew like mold in the dark corners of the ship. Crew members would watch friends and shipmates waste away, their eyes dull, their strength sapping away. The despair was as contagious as the parasites themselves. Yet, amidst the chaos, stories of resilience emerged. Men withstood the torment, fighting off infection with whatever they had, sometimes even risking death to escape the torment. You see, these tiny parasites weren't just enemies of health. They became part of the human story of endurance. They tested the limits of human resilience in ways we can hardly imagine today. They forced sailors to confront their mortality daily, and these experiences left scars, not just physical but psychological. Many sailors came back changed forever, hardened by suffering, their spirits tempered by the brutal realities of seafaring life. Now think about how different it is today. We've got sanitation, medicines, vaccines, all the comforts we take for granted. Back then, a contaminated water barrel could mean death. An unwashed hand could introduce a parasite that would multiply inside you. The knowledge and tools to fight these microscopic enemies were almost non-existent. But the courage to survive? That was universal. Without these brave, suffering men, we wouldn't have the lessons that shaped medicine and hygiene. Their sacrifices paved the way for the health standards we enjoy today. Modern medicine, with its pills, sterilization, and sanitation, stands on the shoulders of those who endured these hideous parasites. We can now protect ourselves with vaccines and antibiotics. We can travel in safety, knowing that the tiny enemies of the past no longer hold us hostage. But never forget, the stories of these sailors are about more than parasites. They're about human grit, about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about courage in the face of microscopic torment. Their sacrifices and suffering remind us of the resilience that runs deep in human history. Think about it. A crew of men, battered by invisible enemies, still pushing forward, still surviving. So next time you're grateful for the clean water, safe food, or the health protections we have today, take a moment. Reflect on the sailors of the colonial era, those brave souls who fought tiny parasites with herbal remedies and sheer willpower. Their legacy is not just in history books, but in the resilience of every person who benefits from their sacrifices. Because in the end, their story is the story of human courage. A story worth remembering, especially when we consider the comfort and safety we enjoy now, thanks to those who endured the suffering often unseen and uncelebrated on the dark, treacherous decks of ships crossing uncharted oceans. If you want to know more about how these tiny enemies were fought, how they shaped lives, or the ongoing impact of these stories on medicine today, there's a whole world of history waiting. But for now, just picture yourself in that cramped, salty vessel, fighting for every breath, every beat of your heart, against an invisible army that could end it all in a flash. That's the true story of colonial seafaring. Humans battling microscopic enemies with courage that still inspires us today.